So in his book, Between Two Trees, and I don't know if you've been reading this along with us, but there's a story that Shane tells. And in the story, he talks about a preacher, a leader, who just had the gift of meeting people when they were in their darkest moments of pain and just whispering in that moment to help lead them through their pain into the light of Christ. He just had that gift to help people in those darkest moments. And as Shane is describing him in the book, if you happen to read it, he's describing this preacher, and he says that as he was sitting on a tailgate late one evening, talking to a meth addict who he'd been visiting with for at least 6 weeks. In that moment, he describes him as taking a hanky out of his pocket and wiping his nose before he said something profound. And immediately I'm like, I know who he's talking about. It's my preacher growing up. It had to been that was how he operated. When it came to a significant moment, the hanky came out, there was the wiping of the nose, and then said something important. And on this night, as they sat on that tailgate, this meth addict was just sharing that he just couldn't do it anymore. He was crying and sobbing almost uncontrollably. And he just described that he was hurting so much. He said, I hurt all day, every day. He said, at least when I was on meth, I could get a smile. And I can't even get that anymore. And he just wept and cried and then just finally just whispered in a quiet voice, I can't do this anymore. And as the silence just kind of hung in the air, Randy takes out the hanky, wipes his nose. And he said to him, have you ever had the experience of having your arm fall asleep? You know, when you sleep on it and lay on it for like 2 to 3 hours and you finally wake up, and in that moment you realize you cannot feel your arm. It's a weird experience because when you touch it, you're touching this mass of flesh, but it doesn't even feel like it's your arm because you can't feel a single thing. But then you begin to kind of shake it and move it to try to get the blood to flow. And then in that moment, you start to feel the first tingles. But what's difficult is the tingles then begin to turn into pain. So much so that when your arm is totally asleep and you start to get the tingles in your arm, when you even touch your leg or touch anything, it hurts. The pain is real because the blood's beginning to flow. It's coming alive again. And then finally, it becomes useful and the blood flows and you can use it again. You can feel it again. And Randy said to Johnny, he just said, I'm glad you're feeling pain because it means you're coming alive again. It means the blood of Christ is beginning to flow and make you alive again. It means you're beginning to feel. When you couldn't feel anything, you were dead. It was just as if you were dead in your sins. But now that you're feeling pain, you're coming to life again. And on that night, a meth addict was learning something that all of us need to learn. Probably, hopefully, some of us are learning it right now. It's this. It's that transformation is painful. Becoming who God wants you to be. When you experience an awakening in your life, and it's not just a one-time thing, it's God working in your life over and over again. It hurts. It's painful. It's difficult. It's hard. It's something that all of us are learning. You know, this is the last sermon in this series we've been doing called Between Two Trees. We began talking about how in the beginning of the Bible, in Genesis chapter 2, you've got the tree of life. And it's providing healing and sustaining, and there's beauty and there's life. But then when Adam and Eve sinned against God and rebelled against God and fell into sin, God blocked them from the tree of life so they wouldn't live perpetually in their sin. But then at the end of the Bible, in Revelation 22, the tree of life shows up again. It's the new heaven and the new earth, and it's providing healing and it's sustaining power. And what Shane talks about in his book is life is lived between the two trees. And life that's lived between the two trees is hard and it's difficult and it's painful. But then he talks about this tree of life between the two trees, the cross of Jesus. Jesus came to pay the price for our sin. He came to redeem us. He came to give us hope. He came to make us alive again so that these dead bodies, these dead lungs, they could breathe again. And so the tree of life, the true tree of life is the cross between the two trees. And when you encounter Jesus, he wants to make you alive again. He wants to breathe life into you. And that process of becoming who God wants you to become, of being made alive again, that is a painful process. The problem is we try to avoid pain. We don't like pain. We want to avoid it. We want to run from it. We want to get as far away as we can from it. We medicate it. We avoid it. And I know why. It's because God didn't originally create us to feel pain. That's not what he created us for. I understand that it was God who created us to live in his presence. He didn't create us to experience death, which is why funerals feel so foreign to us. It's so disorienting because it's not what God intended. And so we want to avoid it as much as possible. And here's what happens. It feels so wrong. Our approach to pain is to get rid of it in any way we can. Sometimes we do it this way. We try to mute the pain with pleasures. One of our approaches to get rid of pain is to mute it with pleasures. Every sensation, whether it's that which we can touch or taste or hear or see, whatever it is, we want to bring it in our life. The problem is whenever we try to mute the pain with pleasures, it's distorted pleasures, and it's never what God intended for us. It doesn't get us closer to God. It actually pushes us further away from him. But we try comfort and wealth and materialism, everything that we can possibly come up with to experience pleasure in this life, to rise up out of the pain. But instead of muting the pain, we just mute the voice of God. And we're not listening to him. We're not hearing him. We just want out of it. Another way we try to avoid pain is through distraction. We just distract ourselves with other things, or denial. We're living in denial of the pain, or even drugs. We medicate it so we don't have to feel it. We don't have to look at it. We don't have to experience it. We don't have to face it. We don't have to go through the suffering. And pain comes to us in all kinds of ways, through emotional pain, from rejection or from abuse, from cutting words or disrespect or a lack of love. And we try to suppress it and distract ourselves from it. And the problem is our approach is not giving room for God to work. Our approach to pain is not leaning into it to allow God to actually use the pain in our life to grow us and to work in our lives and to do what he wants to do. We don't give margin for that. We don't give him time for that. We don't want him to be a part of that. We don't want to actually do the hard work of working through the pain. I kind of know what this is like in this sense. Several years ago, I hurt my lower back. And I don't remember now exactly how I did it. I just remember I was down and out. And it was one of those things, I wasn't moving. I wasn't able to do much. And I was in pain. And I was taking some medication to try to help relax the muscles of my lower back. But I hurt it. But anyway, over time, it started to feel better. And so I got active again. I started playing basketball again, doing what I did, doing the stuff I loved. Back then, we would ski a lot and do all kinds of things. But then I hurt it again. And then I had to go through the process of trying to get it to feel better again. And then one day, I was moving the laundry from one side of the bed to the other. And I just picked up the laundry and moved it here and then fell on the ground. Couldn't move. It threw it out. And I was like, I couldn't hardly move with pain in my lower back, which I know is really sad because now, I'm just not able to do the laundry, like I once did. And I know a lot of you are disappointed about that it's too risky. Something could happen, could throw the back out, so I just can't do the laundry anymore. And, but man, I just tried to put up with it. But what I noticed over time is I was getting less and less active, less basketball, less doing some of the stuff I love. Until one day I was sitting at my desk right here at the church and I was typing. Probably typing a sermon or something. I was just sitting there just typing. And all of a sudden I was like, oh! I was like, that is it. That's ridiculous. And so I buzzed someone down the hall, because I'd never been to a chiropractor. I'm like, who do you use? They told me who they used. I called the chiropractor and scheduled an appointment. I'd always kind of stayed away from it, I guess. So I'm scheduled an appointment right now. This is ridiculous. And so I called the chiropractor. What's going on? Lower back. They keep throwing it out. And it just happened just now. What were you doing? I was typing. I'm an aggressive typer, throwing my whole body into it. Actually, no, I was just completely still stationary. I wasn't doing a single thing and just threw it out. This is ridiculous. So we went to the chiropractor a couple times. It started to kind of get better. But honestly, here's what I've noticed about this whole process. I can just confess to you, I really haven't leaned in to the pain and the hard work of doing what it's going to take probably to get healthier. I've just gotten inactive. I don't run a whole lot. I don't play basketball anymore. I don't do those things anymore. Instead of doing the hard work and leaning into the pain and maybe building my core, building strength, doing what's needed, I'm just trying to avoid the pain, which doesn't really bring healing. It doesn't really make you any better because pain has a voice. Pain is telling me that there's something wrong that needs to be dealt with. There's something wrong that needs our attention. And it's kind of like what Dr. Paul Brand, who moved to India to serve the lepers that were there in India, he discovered something as he worked with them. And here's what he discovered. He discovered that all of the things that they were dealing with, the ulcers, the sores, the blindness, the loss of their limbs and being able to use them, they were all secondary problems due to the loss of feeling. And Dr. Paul Brand, this doctor who went there to serve them, said if he could choose just one gift for his leprosy patients, it would be the gift of pain. If he could choose one gift, it'd be the gift of pain. That they could feel pain. I'm not trying to indicate that they didn't feel pain. They felt all kinds of pain. The pain of loneliness and isolation and loss and immobilization and not being able to do what they once did. There's all kinds of pain and hurt. Maybe you'd call it better suffering was what they were experiencing. It wasn't that they hurt a lot, but they just couldn't feel the pain in their extremities, which led to incredible damage. Sometimes we see pain as a curse when God can use it. Something beneficial, something good in us to make us who He wants us to be, to grow us into the person He wants us to be. And we try to avoid it. We try to medicate it. We try to get around it. But God can bring good through it. And so for the next few minutes, what I really want to do is, I don't want to talk about the why of pain. Why do we have it? What's the cause of it? What's going on? I want to talk about our response to pain. I want to talk for a little bit about what we're going to do with it. Because when we're focused on the why, we tend to get bitter and angry and feelings of unfairness and all kinds of stuff. But when we focus on our response to it, we then become more open to how God really wants to use it. And I just want to talk for a moment about our response to pain. What is it going to look like that could lead to our healing? You see, God is repurposing pain. He transforms us through the pain. That's why if you've grown up in the church, then you are probably familiar with this text from Romans 8:28 that says, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love Him, who've been called according to His purpose. In everything, that includes those bad circumstance, painful situations. For those who love Him and are called according to His purpose, God can bring good out of that. In fact, He does. It leads to good. Ultimately, by His power. And so I want to look at some ways that God is bringing good or transforming us through pain. And here's one of the first ways He does this. Through pain, God uses pain to soften hard hearts. God uses pain to soften hard hearts. I want you to think about Jonah, the prophet who completely ran from God and rebelled. He had a hard heart, not just to God, but he even had a hard heart against people. And it was God that caused Jonah to be inside a fish for 3 days. What was he doing in that experience? He was softening his heart. Not to pay him back, it was to bring him back. Bring him back on mission, to get him back. God was softening his heart through pain. Think about the story that Jesus told of a young man in Luke chapter 15 who said that he wanted nothing to do with his dad, and he totally rebelled, and he just ran away, and he went his own way. And in so doing, it wasn't until he got to the end of himself when he was completely impoverished and broken. He had no money. He had wounded his relationships. It was in that moment of pain that he had his awakening, that he came alive again. He began to feel the pain of his actions and what he had done. He came to his senses, is the way the Bible describes it. It was through pain that God softened his heart so that he could come back. Even the most hard-hearted people reveal soft spots in their armor whenever tragedy strikes. Whether it's a terminal illness or a pending diagnosis or a painful loss. There's amazing ways in which God uses those moments to soften their hearts to Him. There are people in our church right now that are in a relationship with Christ, or they're growing in faith because they went through something painful that opened their eyes and softened their hearts and brought them to Jesus. God uses pain to do that. This is what the psalmist talked about in Psalm 119. We don't know who this psalmist is. He doesn't identify himself. But here's what he says. He says, before I was afflicted, I went astray. Before I was afflicted. But now I obey your word. You're good at what you are good, and what you do is good. Teach me your decrees. It was good for me to be afflicted so that I might learn your decrees. He didn't think it was good at the time. We never do. But when he was going through pain and affliction, he says it was good for me because now I'm following your decrees. My heart was made soft again. God uses these things over and over again. Think about 9/11. Think about 2001. After that horrible tragedy that happened in New York. And what happened to church attendance after that? In Manhattan, where Tim Keller is the minister at Redeemer Presbyterian Church, their attendance grew from 2,400 to 5,800 within weeks. They had to add another total service because of the people who through pain and hardship, the hearts were softened and then began to come back to church. Think about what happened near us in 2011 with the devastating tornado in Joplin, Missouri. 158 people were killed that evening in that event. There were others that were killed indirectly. There were over 1,000 that were critically injured and wounded. And yet that painful event softened people's hearts. My wife and I are both from Joplin. Our families are from Joplin. They were all living in Joplin when it happened. My brother's house was leveled in Joplin because of that tornado. And our home church, College Heights Christian Church there in Joplin, became a distribution center. That became a processing center for volunteers. And it was in those months after that volunteers who were coming to serve from all over the country who wanted to help and do something because of the pain that was in front of them experienced the bride of Christ, the church, loving and serving in such powerful ways that people were coming to Christ who were originally there just to help other people. They were coming to faith in Jesus. They were being baptized into Christ because God was using pain and tragedy to soften their heart. God did this for Paul, the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 12:7. When Paul said God gave him a thorn in the flesh. Now, we don't know exactly what that thorn in the flesh was, but Paul said that God would not take it away. But God revealed why he wouldn't take it away, because there was nothing that, Paul says, so that I wouldn't boast. He wouldn't be arrogant. He wouldn't be self-sufficient. He wouldn't be prideful. In other words, what pain has a way of transforming us, because when you go through pain, when you experience it, pride is replaced with humility. Arrogance or self-independence, self-sufficiency is replaced with interdependence. We grow in our mercy and our compassion for people. When we go through pain, we become more sympathetic to what they're going through. God uses it to soften our hearts and to give us a healthy perspective of both Him and us. This is how God's using pain in our life. He's not going to waste it. He's going to use it. Because people who experience pain care better for other people who are in pain. And so God's going to use it to soften our hearts. Let me give you another reason why God is using pain right now. He's using pain right now, if it's coming into your life, to produce perseverance and to produce character. Perseverance and character. In other words, God's not going to waste it. Something is going to be productive through it. You know, in Psalm 55:22, it says, cast all your cares on the Lord and He will sustain you. Notice it doesn't say, and He will remove them from you. It says He will sustain you through them. He doesn't remove them. He sustains you through them. Now that's important. Because when we are undergoing pain or hardship or discipline, God is using that to grow us, to make us better. What happens to children? who have parents who never let them experience the consequences of their choices or to experience pain, right? I mean, what happens to those kids? It's not good. I mean, we have different words for those kinds of parents. We call them helicopter parents, right? They're hovering over their kids, trying to protect them from all the bad things that happen. I've heard it also be called the drone parents. The drone parents, they hover in front of their kids so they can take pictures and record everything, never letting them actually experience adventure. The drone parent. I've heard of lawnmower parents, the kind of parents who try to mow down everything that's in the path of their kids so they don't experience pain and hardship. You know, here's what happens. What happens to a kid whose parents don't let them experience pain and hardship? They grow up to look like this. That's what. It's an inflated view of everything. It's a bubble they put around them to try to insulate themselves from pain. They're not relevant to the real world. They see things from a perspective that's not even healthy or accurate or good. It's what they look like. In fact, I was reading an article that came out here in 2019. It was an international article, and it was looking at children's development. And as it looked at kids' development and what they do from a very young age that aids in their development, here's what it said in the 2019 article. It said that children develop better when they're at risk. When they go through risk, they develop healthier and better. Not the kind of risk that says, you know, hey, here's a busy street, see what happens, see if you can get across there and watch and see the outcome. But they said it this way, it's by putting them in scenarios where there is risk involved, where they can get hurt. And what they began to look at is playgrounds. Kids that grow up in playgrounds that are, you know, rubberized and safe and no pointy objects, nothing that can hurt them. What happens with their development versus kids that were put into playgrounds where they purposely put rock and stone. Obviously, the study wasn't done in the United States of America, too much litigation. Rocks, stones, wood. They encouraged the kids to climb high. They encouraged them to climb trees. They were encouraging this behavior, and here's what they found as the result. They found that the kids that were encouraged to do those things and allowed to do those things, they developed better perspective and understanding of safety. They developed a better understanding of resilience, of social skills, and even better learning. Why? Because they were allowed to explore and experience, and there were real consequences. If you fall down, that's going to hurt if you fall on that. And so they actually learned better, which is why, you know, our preschool playground is going to go right in front of the new worship center over here. You know, right now it's just a major construction zone over there. And so we've now told Nabbles, hey, just leave it. We're going to do it just like that, just the way it is right now. So that's going to be an interesting experiment that we're going to try and see how it turns out. We think our kids will be better for it. But yeah, the pain that is used, it grows us. Here's Hebrews 12, 9 through 11. Moreover, we have all had human fathers who disciplined us, and we respected them for it. How much more should we submit to the Father of spirits and live? They disciplined us for a little while as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, in order that we may share in His holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful. Later on, however, it's productive. It produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. If you allow pain to train you, if you allow the discipline to train you, it's going to be productive in your life. The problem is we don't allow it to train us because we short-circuit it. I don't want to experience pain. I'm not going to lean into the pain. I'm not going to go there. When I start to feel pain, something in my life, I'm not going to talk about that. The wall comes up. And because we never deal with it, we don't become healthy, we don't become whole, we don't become better. We just try to avoid it. But Scripture reveals that God can use it for good. In James chapter 1, 2 through 4, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Let it finish its work. That takes patience. That takes time. That takes allowing God to work through the pain in your life. Let it finish its work. There is something productive that's going to come from this. I mean, think of how many times I've been frustrated with my kids because they don't finish their work. You know, you give them an assignment, you know, clean up this or clean up the table, clean up the room, and they don't finish. You're so frustrated. It's a half-hearted job. How often must God be so frustrated with me because when He is in the middle of a good work in my life, I don't want the work anymore. I don't let God finish that work. Now, I want to walk away. I want to avoid. I want to stop right where I am instead of leaning into the pain to let Him do what He needs to do. In Romans chapter 5, 3 through 4, we read that we also glory in our sufferings. This is right after Paul said we glory in God. He says we also glory in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, and perseverance, character, and character, hope. This is producing something in us. And here's what this means. It means that you can go through pain in this life, and you can look at it different than the world does. Here's some perspectives that you can have that the world doesn't have, like this. God is not punishing you, God is preparing you. How often do we see people in the world that when something bad's happening, they look at it like God just punishing them? I mean, he can do that. He can discipline. He can punish. But oftentimes, God is not punishing. He's preparing. That's what he's doing for his people. As people who follow Jesus, he's preparing you. It reminds me of John chapter 14 where Jesus talks about how I'm going away to prepare a place for you. But then what he goes on to basically describe is that he's not just preparing a place for you, he's preparing you for that place. You too are in preparation for what he wants to do in your life. He's transforming you. He's working you. It's not easy. It's painful, but he's doing this in you. Here's another phrase that you might believe that the world doesn't. Trust his plan, not your pain. For our world, they experience pain, and they trust the pain. Obviously, this is wrong. It's got to stop. But when you trust the plan of God, you're looking at it from a totally different perspective, a heavenly perspective, that God's going to work through this. We don't avoid it at all costs. We lean into him and trust him through the pain. He's going to sustain you through it. How about this perspective that the world doesn't have? Don't just go through pain, grow through the pain. Don't just go through pain, grow through the pain. Now, what does that mean? Basically, what it means is this. People who are just going through the pain, they're just looking at the pain in the here and now. They become angry and bitter and cynical because it's a short-term view, and they're just focusing on what's happening to them right now. They're not looking at a grow view, which is a heavenly perspective, much broader. A heavenly perspective that believes that God is working through this pain and in this pain, and he's with us in this pain, and he has a power to transform that pain. It's a much more future-focused view that allows and gives God the room to work in our hearts. It carries the perspective that pain is not wasted, that God is going to do something through this in my life. Those are perspectives we have when we trust that God is actually producing perseverance and character in our life. Let me give you a third way, God, quickly, that he's using pain. God is using pain to magnify the beauty of heaven. Whenever you go through a difficult circumstance, a tragedy, in that moment, you're reminded there's a heaven and this is not it. And you're reminded in that moment that God is preparing something beautiful and grand and good, and that you're living not just for the here and now, you're living for there. You've got the future in mind. And that heavenly perspective reminds you just how beautiful it really is, that in comparison to what you're going through now, it far surpasses. Like, look at this text that comes from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. It says, for this slight momentary affliction, you may also read this light momentary affliction. It never seems light at the time. But it is preparing us for an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Look, our afflictions can feel super heavy to us now, but in comparison to the future glory, they're so light, they're so momentary, they're so fleeting. That perspective is what will help you to keep on keeping on. It will give you perseverance. It will grow your character. You'll know who God is better if you have that heavenly perspective. Because if you don't, you'll try to fill your life with everything you can to lift you out of the pain. It's kind of like this. I'll pick up this balloon really quick. I think a lot of times when people experience pain, they don't want to experience it. They want to avoid it. They want to get rid of it. So what do? They fill, if this represents your life, you fill it with everything you can to try to lift yourself up out of the pain so it feels better. So it's pleasure. You fill your life with pleasure. It's never quite enough, so you got to do a little more. And it might be materialism or money. And you keep trying to fill your life. Why? Because you just want to rise up. You want to come up out of the pain and fill your life with something that's just going to feel better. But here's the problem. Suffering is the pin. Suffering is the pin. I know. Go ahead if you need to close your ears. I'm not going to hold the mic up to it. Suffering's the pain. And people who fill their life with something other than Christ. Just kidding. People who fill their life because they want to rise up out of the pain. Always experience a moment when it comes crashing down, because suffering, pain is the pin that pops the air out of a balloon, out of your life. And you come crashing back down, and you realize in that moment that you are living for the here and now, but you're missing it all. Romans 8:18 says this. It says, I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. Our sufferings are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed to us. This view is a view that has a heavenly perspective that is far different than the here and now perspective that most of this world lives with. What God is describing for us is the suffering we encounter now is so contrasted with the beauty of heaven. It just makes it all that more desirable and appealing, and we long for it. And that's a good thing. And then finally, I just want to close with this, that God uses pain also to make us more like Jesus, to make us more like Him. As Corey was preparing his worship thoughts, one of the thoughts that he had in mind in this worship service was just that we become what we behold. We become what we behold. And that is so true, that when we're experiencing pain and suffering, God wants you to behold the person of Jesus, to look to Him. He's the perfect example of what it looks like to go through pain and suffering, even when you're facing your fears, to do it with courage and hope in God. That Jesus Himself would submit Himself to death, even death on a cross, and the suffering that came with it. Jesus demonstrates for us that before you have a resurrection and an ascension, you got to go through the cross. You got to go through the pain and the suffering of this world before you experience the glory that is to follow. Jesus is just the first of many more to come. He's showing us the path. That when we go through the pain and we lean into the Father, when we say, not my will, but yours be done, whenever we lean into the pain and trust God for the journey, whenever we're faithful to Him, He will bless us. He will fill us. He will sustain us. Even Jesus, it says, for the joy set before Him, endured the cross. We become more like Christ as we go through pain and suffering. We begin to look like Him. Because we too. The Bible says that Jesus was made perfect through suffering. It says, in bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom and through whom everything exists, should make the pioneer of their salvation perfect through what He suffered. That's Jesus. He was made perfect through what He suffered. Both the one who makes people holy, Jesus, and those who are made holy, us, are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Jesus was made perfect through suffering. God is also making you mature, complete, perfect through your sufferings if you trust Him and lean into Him in the pain. This is why God is using it. This week in our small group guides, if you're doing that along with your small group, the devotional guides through your week, Alan Tiger, our college life minister, shares the story. It's a powerful story, especially the way that he tells it. It's in week 10 of our guide, and he talks about that moment when his brother, at 24 years of age, died. He'd been battling cancer. And Alan describes that moment there in the waiting room at a hospital when they were out of town near Little Rock, Arkansas. And there as they sat in that waiting room, he said it was completely silent. He said even the turning of the pages of his Bible seemed like it was too noisy. He said they got in their cars and they made that long 4-hour drive home. And he says it was completely silent. And then they went to a funeral home. And while they're in a funeral home, it was so silent. And Alan said he hated the silence. He hated it. But it was through that experience and others in his life, he said, there's something that I noted through that experience. He says, it was in those moments when I was forced into silence that I now can see that I was closest to God. He said, when all the distractions were gone, he goes, I was left with only two things: the voice of pain and the voice of my healer. And he said, I'll let you guess which one was louder. When you lean into God, the voice of your healer is speaking to you, talking to you, working in you, bringing to completion a work that he's already begun. He works in your pain. He works in your suffering. And so we fix our eyes on him. We just look to him who endured the cross, scorning its shame. We trust him. He was made perfect through what he suffered. So will we. Our hearts will be softened. Character and perseverance and resolve will grow. Our eyes will be open to a heavenly reward that will so far surpass what we're going through now. It makes these afflictions seem a little lighter. That it will become more like Jesus if we go through what he went through. And so I want us just to do that. I want us to fix our eyes on him. So I want you just to stand to your feet. I'd like for our servers to be dismissed for a time of communion. And as we sing this song right now, I want us to see Jesus. See his hands. See his feet. See his wounds.